The crowd had gathered in the dirt square of Caldwell, Kansas on a Thursday afternoon in the blazing summer of 1882, and the silence that fell over them was the kind that precedes something irreversible. Grace Graves stood at the center of that silence with her chin raised and her dark eyes burning, her dress torn at the shoulder where the marshal's deputy had grabbed her wrists still red from the rope they had used to drag her through the main street like she was something shameful that needed to be displayed. 40, maybe 50 people standing in a half-circle around her, and not one of them had stepped forward. Not one of them had opened their mouths. They had watched. They had always watched. And then Levi Redmond pushed through the crowd. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar from the heat. His deputy's badge caught the afternoon light like a dare. He walked straight to the center of that square with a stride that made men step aside without even knowing why they were doing it, and he stopped 3 feet from where Grace stood trembling with fury and humiliation, and he turned his back to her to face the crowd. Not to dismiss her, to shield her. His voice came out steady, low, carrying every word with the deliberate weight of a man who had chosen exactly when to spend his anger. "This woman asked for nothing," he said. The crowd stirred, uncomfortable. "And you gave her exactly that," Levi continued. "You gave her suspicion when she deserved welcome. You gave her locked doors when she deserved shelter. You gave her rumors when she deserved the basic decency of a name spoken clean. This woman asked for nothing." He paused, and the pause was a blade. "And she deserved everything you withheld." Nobody moved. Not the marshal. Not the shopkeepers with their arms folded across their chests. Not the women who had whispered Grace's name like a curse. They all stood there, and something passed through the crowd that was not quite shame, but was close enough to its cousin to sting. Grace Graves did not cry. She had stopped crying in front of people long before she arrived in Caldwell. But she felt something shift in her chest, something that had been sealed shut for nearly 2 years, and when Levi turned to look at her, when those gray eyes found hers with something raw and searching in them, she understood with absolute clarity that nothing would ever be the same again. She just didn't know yet whether that was a promise or a threat. Grace Graves had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas 9 months before that afternoon, in October of 1881, on the evening stage from Wichita. She had stepped off that coach onto the main street of Caldwell with 2 things: a worn leather trunk that held everything she owned in the world, and a letter of employment from a man named Harold Dawes who had advertised in the Topeka Commonwealth for a schoolteacher with experience in reading, arithmetic, and basic geography. Grace had experience in all 3. She had spent 4 years teaching in a schoolhouse outside of Lawrence, Kansas, before the circumstances of her life had reorganized themselves in ways she had not chosen and could not have predicted. The circumstances, in plain language, were these. Her father had died. The farm had gone to debt collectors. Her younger brother Emmett had gone west to try his luck in the silver territories near Nevada, which meant he was as good as gone for years. And Grace, at 26 years old, had been left with her education, her determination, and the kind of quiet stubbornness that people sometimes mistake for coldness. She was not cold. She was careful. There was a difference that the town of Caldwell never bothered to learn. Harold Dawes, it turned out, had died of a fever 3 weeks before she arrived. His widow, a thin, nervous woman named Mrs. Dawes, had met Grace at the stage depot with apologies, and a look that suggested Grace was one more catastrophe added to an already catastrophic autumn. The schoolhouse position, Mrs. Dawes explained, was under dispute. The town council had not formally approved the hiring. Harold had acted on his own authority. The town had mixed feelings about a woman teacher, particularly one who came from Lawrence with no husband, no family in the territory, and no local references. Grace had stood on that street, the October wind cutting down through the flat Kansas plain like a knife, and absorbed all of this with the stillness she had learned to use as armor. "Where is the town council?" she had asked. "They meet on Fridays," Mrs. Dawes said. "I will be there Friday," Grace said. She had found a room at the boarding house run by a woman named Edna Croft, who charged 50 cents a week, and made it clear through the angle of her chin that she disapproved of single women boarding alone, but could not afford to turn away paying customers in October. Grace paid 4 weeks in advance. She counted out the coins from a small cloth purse with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly what remained. On Friday morning, she had walked into the town council meeting. The council was 6 men in a room above the feed store, and they had looked at her the way men in rooms above feed stores tended to look at women who walked in without being invited, with the particular mixture of annoyance and curiosity that passes for authority when it has no better tools. The chairman, a man named Burton Hale who owned the lumber yard and spoke in the slow, deliberate cadence of someone who had never been told to hurry, had informed Grace that the position required further consideration. He had said this the way people say things they have already decided, using the language of process to disguise the language of refusal. Grace had presented her credentials, her letter of certification from Lawrence, a reference from Reverend Mitchell of the First Methodist Church, a sample of her curriculum organized by age group and subject. She had stood in that room for 45 minutes and answered every question they asked her with the kind of calm precision that should have been conclusive. The council had thanked her and said they would deliberate. They deliberated for 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, Grace had done the things a sensible person does when waiting in a town that has not yet decided what to make of her. She had walked the streets. She had introduced herself to shopkeepers. She had attended church on 3 consecutive Sundays. She had helped Mrs. Dawes, who was struggling alone now in a house that had been sized for 2, with the canning she needed to finish before the hard freeze came. She had not made a nuisance of herself. She had not complained. She had simply been present clearly, quietly, in a way that asked nothing of anyone and expected nothing in return. This, it turned out, was precisely what Caldwell could not forgive. The town had decided things about Grace Graves before they knew her, in the particular way that small frontier towns decide things about women who arrive alone. They decided she was hiding something. There were whispered theories. That she had left Lawrence under scandal. That the man who was supposed to marry her had discovered something disqualifying. That she had a dark past she was dragging behind her like a shadow. None of these things were true. Grace's past was this. She had worked hard, loved her father, missed her brother, taught children to read, and watched the economy of Kansas dismantle her family's land in pieces over the course of 5 years. That was the whole of it. There was no scandal, no secret, no buried betrayal. She was simply a woman who had needed work and had come to the place that advertised it. But a story that ordinary is not satisfying to people who have already decided to be suspicious. And so, the rumors continued. She first saw Levi Redmond in the 3rd week of November when she was coming out of the general store with a paper parcel of flour and dried beans, and he was coming in. They nearly collided in the doorway. He stepped back, touched the brim of his hat, said, "Ma'am, pardon me," and held the door for her. She said thank you and walked on, but she had noticed the badge. And she had noticed the way he looked at her. Not with the sideways assessment she had grown used to from the men of Caldwell, the calculating look that was trying to determine what she was and whether she was a problem, but with a directness that was somehow more respectful than a dozen other men's politeness. He had looked at her like she was simply a person in a doorway, which in Caldwell in November of 1881 was a more radical act than it sounds. She thought about that look for longer than she should have. Levi Redmond had been the deputy of Caldwell for 3 years by the time Grace arrived. He had come to the territory from Missouri at the age of 22, after his family's general store burned down in a fire that killed his father, and left his mother with a settlement from the county that was too small to be useful and too large to ignore. His mother had gone to live with her sister in Kansas City. Levi had gone where men went in the autumn of 1878 when they needed a purpose, and had nothing left to anchor them in the place where they'd grown up. He had hired on first as a cattle drover, then as a hired guard for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway during a particularly fractious period of rail disputes, and then, through a combination of demonstrated calm under pressure and a recommendation from the railway's security chief, he had been offered the deputy position in Caldwell by Marshal Thomas Cale. He had taken it and had been good at it in the way that certain men are good at keeping order, not through force primarily, but through the kind of steady, unruffled presence that makes trouble feel unnecessary. He was 25 when Grace arrived in Caldwell. He would turn 26 the following January. He was not a man who involved himself in the social machinery of the town. He did his job. He kept his opinion mostly to himself. He lived alone in a two-room house at the north end of town that he had built himself over 2 summers, with a small garden in the back that grew tomatoes in July and August and sat bare the rest of the year. He ate dinner most nights at the Prairie Rose dining room, where Edna Croft's sister Ruth made a beef stew that was the best thing within 40 miles. He read in the evenings, history, mostly, and newspapers when he could get them. He was not unfriendly. He was simply private in the same way that a still river is not stagnant but simply moving below a surface that does not announce itself. He had heard the rumors about Grace Graves within a week of her arrival, because in Caldwell rumors moved faster than the wind, and in approximately the same direction as it happened to be blowing, which was usually toward whoever was most convenient. He had listened to them with the specific stillness he applied to information. He did not yet have enough facts to evaluate. He had his own form of inquiry, which was observation. He observed Grace Graves over the course of November and December. He saw her help Mrs. Dawes carry firewood without being asked. He saw her sit with the Alvarez children, whose mother had died in childbirth the previous spring and whose father, a Mexican rancher named Diego Alvarez, was struggling with grief and 3 small children, and a language barrier that made the town's sympathy largely inaccessible to him, for 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon, reading to them from a book she had brought from her own room. He saw her navigate Edna Croft's pointed rudeness every single morning at breakfast with a grace that was not submission, but was something more controlled and more difficult. The deliberate decision not to let someone else's smallness make her smaller. He saw her go to the town council meeting in December when they finally called her back, and he saw her come out of that building with her face carefully composed and her hands very still at her sides, which was how he knew without asking that it had not gone well. He was sitting on the bench outside the marshal's office across the street. He stood when she emerged. She saw him. Something passed between them that was not yet communication but was almost its negative image, the space where communication had not yet happened, shaped by the exact pressure of what was being held back. She walked across the street to him because she had learned in her life that when a person extends a small, wordless kindness, the only real response is to acknowledge it. "They want another month," she said, "pending review of further references." "Do you have further references?" "I have the ones I brought. They are sufficient. They know they are sufficient." He was quiet for a moment. "Burton Hale doesn't want a school teacher he didn't personally recruit," he said. "It isn't about your qualifications." She looked at him steadily. "I know that." "I'm sorry," he said. It was such a simple thing to say, it was so direct. She had not heard anyone in Caldwell say something that straightforward to her in 2 months, and the simplicity of it hit her somewhere unguarded. She kept her face composed, but she nodded once slowly. "Thank you," she said. "Deputy Redmond," he said. "Levi Redmond." "I know your name," she said. And then, because she had been watching him as long as he had been watching her, "You're not like most of them." She walked back to the boarding house before he could respond, which was deliberate, because she had learned the value of precise timing in conversation, and also because she wasn't sure what she wanted him to say in response, and she didn't want to find out yet. Levi stood on the boardwalk outside the marshal's office for a long moment after she left, watching the spot where she had been standing, and then went inside to file a report about a stolen saddle that he had already mostly forgotten. January came with a cold that settled into the bones of the Kansas plain like it intended to stay. Grace received another letter from the town council, this one asking if she could provide character references from the community of Caldwell itself, since outsider references were of limited value to local decision-making. This was a trap so obvious it was almost admirable in its brazenness. They were asking her to produce character witnesses from a community that had spent 3 months refusing to know her character. She sat in her room at Edna Croft's boarding house and read the letter 3 times. Then she put it flat on the table and sat with her hands folded and thought about what she was going to do. She had $42 left from the money she had brought from Lawrence. At 50 cents a week for the room with meals, she had perhaps 18 weeks of solvency remaining if she was disciplined. After that, she would need income. The schoolteacher position was the only position in Caldwell that matched her skills and that paid a living wage. There was laundry work, but laundry work paid almost nothing and broke the hands. There was cooking at the Prairie Rose, but Ruth Croft was protective of her kitchen. There were other options, all of them worse. She had not come this far to accept worse. The next morning she knocked on Diego Alvarez's door. Diego Alvarez was a wiry, quiet man of 30 years who ran a cattle operation 7 miles south of Caldwell, and who came into town twice a week for supplies and to check on his eldest child, 8-year-old Maria, who attended the church school that met in the basement of the First Baptist Church on Wednesday mornings. His English was halting and functional. His Spanish was fluid and beautiful and completely useless in most of Caldwell's social spaces. His children, Maria and 5-year-old Carlos and 3-year-old little Rosa, were wild with energy and starved for female attention in the particular way that motherless children sometimes are. Not tragically, because Diego loved them well, but in the way that speaks to a specific kind of absence. Grace had been reading to those children since November, entirely without being asked, entirely without telling anyone about it, and entirely without expecting anything in return. She sat across from Diego Alvarez at his kitchen table that January morning and explained her situation plainly. She needed a character reference for the town council. She had not helped his children in order to obtain one and did not wish him to feel obligated, but she was asking directly because she needed to ask someone, and she had learned that Diego Alvarez was a man who said what he meant. Diego looked at her for a long moment. Then he said in careful English, "I will write a letter, and I will deliver it myself." "You don't have to deliver it yourself," Grace said. "I know I don't have to," he said. His letter was 3 sentences long and entirely factual. Grace Graves had spent 6 weeks coming to his home to read to and teach his children with no compensation and no obligation. His children had learned to count to 50 and could identify written letters through the alphabet. He considered her a person of good character and strong capability. It was the most honest letter ever submitted to the Caldwell Town Council, and they filed it without comment. But something had shifted. Diego Alvarez was not a man whose opinion the council members could dismiss without consequence, because Diego Alvarez owned 300 head of cattle and did business with half the merchants in town. When he walked into the council meeting on the 3rd Friday of January and sat down without being invited and waited with his hat in his lap until Burton Hale acknowledged him, the calculation in that room changed. Grace did not know this had happened. She found out about it weeks later from Levi. She had been buying thread at the general store when Levi came in for something, and they found themselves at the counter at the same time, and it seemed rude not to speak. "Diego Alvarez showed up at the council meeting," Levi said, with the careful casualness of someone delivering information they've been thinking about for a while. "Told them he was prepared to take his business to Wichita if they kept stalling on your appointment. He said it very quietly and very politely and left immediately after so no one could accuse him of making a scene." Grace stared at him. "He didn't tell me he was going to do that." "No," Levi said. "I don't imagine he felt he needed to." She was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think you should know that not everyone in this town has decided against you," he said. "And because I thought you might want to know that what you did for those children mattered to someone." She looked at him with the measuring kind of look she gave to things she needed to understand more fully before she trusted them. He did not look away. He had the quality, she had noticed, of remaining very still under scrutiny, which was both disarming and somehow reassuring. "What is your interest in my situation, Deputy Redmond?" she asked. "Levi," he said, "I told you that in December." "What is your interest in my situation, Levi?" she said. He was quiet for exactly long enough that she knew he was choosing his words instead of producing them automatically. "I've been here 3 years," he said. "I've watched this town decide about people before they know them, and then hold to it because changing their mind feels like admitting something. I've watched it happen to Diego Alvarez since he arrived. I've watched it happen to the Mennonite families that settled outside town. I'm tired of watching it happen and doing nothing, and you seem like someone it is particularly unjust to do it to. Because I'm a woman alone. Because you are clearly good," he said, "and clear things shouldn't be this difficult." She stood very still. Something moved in her chest that she did not permit herself to examine immediately. "Thank you," she said, which was what she said to him when she didn't know what else to say, and it was the truest available option. She went home and thought about Levi Redmond for a very long time. The council approved her appointment in February of 1882. The vote was 4-2, with Burton Hale voting against, and making it clear through his body language that he was registering his dissent for the historical record. Grace received the news from the council's secretary on a Wednesday morning and went directly to the schoolhouse to inventory what was available, because she had learned a long time ago that the best response to good news is immediate action before someone finds a reason to reverse it. The schoolhouse was a one-room building on the east end of town with 22 desks, a cast-iron stove that needed new fire bricks, a blackboard that needed chalk, and a collection of primers that were 3 years out of date. She spent the rest of that Wednesday making a list of what was needed and calculating what the school budget could cover and what she would need to request from the council. She worked until it was too dark to see and walked back to the boarding house in the February cold with her list folded in her pocket and a feeling in her chest that she recognized, after some confusion, as contentment. She started teaching the following Monday, February 13, 1882, with 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 13, including Maria Alvarez, who arrived with her hair braided in 2 neat plaits and her slate tucked under her arm with the proprietary confidence of someone who has been waiting for this and intends to take full advantage. Teaching was the thing Grace was best at in the world. She knew this about herself without arrogance, the way a person can know they have a particular capacity without needing to announce it. She was good at finding the place where a child's understanding had stalled and breaking through it from a new angle. She was good at making arithmetic feel like a story and geography feel like an adventure and reading feel like a door that had been waiting to be opened. The children responded to her with the directness that children use when they've found an adult who is genuinely on their side. They worked hard, complained loudly, competed fiercely with each other, and came back every day. By the end of the first week, Grace Graves was the best thing that had happened to Caldwell's children in years, and everyone in the school could see it. The parents were slower to come around. There were still the rumors. They had quieted slightly but not stopped, and Grace navigated them the way she navigated everything, with the combination of careful observation and deliberate stillness that she had developed over years of living in circumstances she had not chosen. She did not go out of her way to court approval. She did not lower herself to respond to gossip. She did her job. She paid her rent. She read in the evenings. And on Sundays she attended church and sat in the third pew from the back and sang the hymns in the clear, even voice she had inherited from her mother. She and Levi had fallen into a pattern by March that neither of them had named, and neither of them was willing to examine too closely yet. He stopped by the schoolhouse on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons on his way back from his circuit patrol, which took him east along the river trail and back through the south part of town. He would knock on the open door, and sometimes she was still with the last students and he would wait outside on the step, and sometimes she was alone cleaning the blackboard or grading slates and he would come in. They talked. About the town, about the students, about the news from Wichita and Topeka that came in on the stage, about books, about the things they had seen in their lives before they came to Caldwell. He told her about the fire that had taken his father, quietly, in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has had sufficient time to make peace with the shape of a grief, but not to forget its edges. She told him about her brother Emmett and the Nevada Silver Territories, and the way she sometimes worried, in the small hours of cold nights, that she would not hear from him before something went wrong. One Tuesday in late March he arrived at the schoolhouse as she was struggling to replace the fire brick on the cast-iron stove, which had finally crumbled, and which she had been waiting 2 weeks for the council to address without result. He came in, assessed the situation, and without comment took off his coat and spent 40 minutes replacing the brick with tools from the schoolhouse's maintenance box, and a level of quiet competence that made the job look simple. "You didn't have to do that," she said when it was done. "The council should have done it 3 weeks ago," he said. "I know, but you didn't have to." He looked at her across the room. The afternoon light was coming in through the west window in the particular way it did in March, when the sun was finally getting some angle back, and it caught the dust still hanging in the air from the brickwork and made the whole room look like something painted. She was aware, with sudden sharp clarity, of how close they were in this small space, and of the warmth that the newly working stove was throwing out, and of the way Levi Redmond looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching and the way she had been watching anyway. "Grace," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, just that. Just the word with enough in it to constitute an entire question. "I know," she said, which answered it. But they were both careful people, and careful people do not move at the speed of the feeling. They move at the speed of certainty. April in Caldwell was wet and warm by turns, the Kansas spring doing its annual negotiation between winter and summer through the medium of rain and wind and days of startling, clear, golden warmth. The prairie around the town came alive in colors that Grace had not fully credited when she arrived in October. The rippling green of the grassland, the wildflowers along the creek beds, the enormous dome of the sky that was so blue in April it seemed almost theatrical. She began to love the landscape. She had not expected to. She had expected to manage it, the way she managed most circumstances that were not of her choosing. But the Kansas plain in spring had an honesty to it, a complete lack of concealment in its wide, flat openness, that appealed to something in her that valued the truth of things. She was walking the creek trail on a Saturday morning in late April when she found Levi there. He was sitting on a flat rock by the water with a newspaper, which he lowered when he heard her approach, and they looked at each other with the particular rueful recognition of people who are simultaneously not surprised and not quite prepared. "Saturday is my patrol-off day," he said. "I know," she said. "I didn't know you came here. I come here most Saturdays when the weather holds. You." "I've been walking the creek every Saturday since March." A pause. The creek went on with its business between them. "Shall I leave?" he asked. "No," she said simply. She sat on the other end of the flat rock and they talked for 3 hours. They talked about everything and nothing, which is the vocabulary of two people who are discovering that the space between them is interesting regardless of what fills it. They talked about whether there was a good chance of rain in May. They talked about a speech that President Arthur had made in Washington regarding railroad land grants that Levi had read in the paper. They talked about Maria Alvarez, who had read an entire page aloud in class that week without a single hesitation, and about how Diego Alvarez had wept when Grace told him, quietly and privately, because she had known he would want to know. At some point in the afternoon, the conversation quieted, and they were simply there by the water in the April sun, and it was not uncomfortable silence but the other kind. The kind that means two people have found a place they can be in together without needing to perform anything. When the sun got low and Grace said she should start back, Levi walked with her. They walked the whole way back to the town in the early evening light, side by side, not touching. But at the edge of town, where the trail met the first street, he stopped. "Grace," he said. She turned and looked at him and waited. "I would like to call on you properly," he said. "If that's something you'd be willing to consider." He said it straight. No maneuvering, no approach by implication. She had noticed by now that this was one of his fundamental qualities. When something mattered to him, he said it directly, because he understood that indirection was a form of cowardice disguised as delicacy. She stood looking at him in the early evening light of Caldwell, Kansas in April 1882, and felt the hidden, careful, preserved interior part of herself that she had been protecting for years make a decision without consulting the rest of her. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He walked back to his house at the north end of town with his newspaper under his arm, and an expression that he was not quite managing to keep entirely composed. And Grace walked to the boarding house and sat on the edge of her bed, and thought that she was either the wisest woman in Kansas or the most foolish, and that in both cases the answer was already made. They called it calling, because that was the appropriate word for 1882, but what it was in practice was simply the formalizing of what had already been happening. They spent time together with the full mutual acknowledgement that they were choosing to do so and why. He called at the boarding house on Sunday afternoons, and they sat in Edna Croft's front parlor, which Edna made available with approximately the enthusiasm of a woman watching an unavoidable weather event. And they talked, while Edna's cat provided chaperoning of a sort by occupying the chair between them and refusing to move. They walked on the creek trail Saturday mornings. He brought her the Topeka Commonwealth when the stage brought it in. She made him coffee in the small iron pot she kept in her room when he walked her back from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the evening was cold enough to justify it. It was quiet and careful and deeply felt, the way things are when two people who have had some experience of loss are choosing to try again at something that requires courage. There were people in Caldwell who watched this development with disapproval, mostly because it provided new material for the existing rumors about Grace, and partly because Levi Redmond had previously been safely unavailable, which was useful to people who needed someone available to be suspicious of. The disapproval expressed itself in glances and comments made at a distance, and the particular way that Edna Croft began to make her morning remarks slightly more pointed than usual. Levi was aware of all of it. He was a deputy in a small town, which meant he was the town's primary observer whether he wished to be or not, and he missed very little of what moved through Caldwell's social atmosphere. He also understood that the social atmosphere of Caldwell was not his primary obligation and never had been. His obligation was to the law and to his own conscience, and both of those were entirely at peace with the direction things were going. Grace was less practiced at ignoring the social pressure, not because she cared more about approval but because she had less margin for error. A deputy whose romantic choices are disapproved of is inconvenienced. A woman schoolteacher whose romantic choices are disapproved of risks her position. She was aware of this, carefully and constantly, in the way that women in that time and place were required to be aware of the invisible lines drawn around their freedom. She told Levi about it one evening in May directly, because she had found that directness was the only language they shared and the only one she trusted. "I need to be careful," she said. "Not because I'm ashamed of anything. Because the council already approved me on a narrow vote and Burton Hale is looking for any reason to revisit that decision." Levi was quiet. "I know," he said. "I've thought about that." "I'm not asking you to stop," she said. "I'm telling you what I'm carrying." "I know you're not asking me to stop," he said. "I'm telling you that I'm not going to." He said it simply, firmly, without drama, which was somehow the most romantic thing he could have said, because it came from the part of him that did not need an audience. She reached across the space between them on Edna Croft's parlor settee and put her hand briefly over his, just for a moment, just long enough, and then moved it back before Edna's cat could report the incident to Edna herself. May became June. June brought the full force of Kansas summer, the heat that rose off the flat land like something impatient, the thunderstorms that arrived without much warning and threw lightning across the entire sky in displays that were terrifying and magnificent simultaneously, the smell of the grass and the dust, and the distant promise of rain. School let out for summer at the end of June, which meant Grace's days became her own in a way they hadn't been since October. She used them deliberately. She wrote letters to the council proposing a summer reading hour for children who wanted it. She helped Mrs. Dawes with her garden. She began organizing the schoolhouse library with a catalog system she had developed during her years in Lawrence. And she spent more time with Levi. The freedom of summer, the heat that seemed to make the normal rules of Caldwell feel slightly less enforced, the long evenings that lasted until after 9 o'clock, all of this created space between them that felt different from the careful, chaperone-adjacent Sunday afternoon visits. They walked further along the creek. They sat outside his house in the evening sometimes, when the air was too close inside any building. In 2 chairs they dragged to the small patch of flat ground by the garden. They talked in the way that people talk when the light is going golden and everything feels like it might be possible. He kissed her for the first time in the 3rd week of July, by the creek on a Saturday morning when a thunderstorm had threatened, and then passed south of them, leaving the air washed and electric and smelling of rain that had fallen somewhere else. It was a real kiss, the kind that acknowledges something rather than asks a question, and she kissed him back in the same language. When they separated, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because some things are better not immediately translated into words. "Levi," she said finally. "I know," he said. Same word she had used back in March. Same weight. She laughed. She did not laugh as often as she should, having spent too long in circumstances that demanded gravity, but she laughed now genuinely, and it changed her whole face in a way that made him decide on several things at once. But the summer could not hold everything at bay, and in August, the hidden motive that had been gathering behind Burton Hale's formal objections finally manifested itself in a way that made everything much more serious. It came out in pieces, the way bad things usually do when they've been kept quiet for a while. The first piece was a complaint filed with the county school board, not with the town council, which was clever because it bypassed the council where Grace now had some allies, and went to a different authority. The complaint alleged that Grace Graves was conducting herself in a manner incompatible with the moral standards expected of a school teacher in a Christian community. It cited her unmarried status, her lack of permanent roots in the community, and what it described as irregular and unsuitable personal associations. The irregular and unsuitable personal associations were, transparently, Levi. Levi found out about the complaint from the county sheriff, who was a friend and who thought he ought to know. He came to the schoolhouse that afternoon, not Tuesday or Thursday, but a Monday, which told Grace immediately that something was wrong, and he closed the door behind him and told her what he knew. She listened. He watched her face go through the particular sequence of expressions she made when absorbing a new threat, the brief flash of anger, then the immediate suppression of it into something cool and analytical, then the settling into the particular stillness that meant she was planning. "Hale filed it," she said. "It was not a question. Probably. The complaint doesn't name the filer. It's him." She looked at the blackboard she had spent the morning covering with multiplication tables. "He's been waiting for a reason and we gave him one." "You gave him nothing," Levi said with a sharpness that surprised her. "We have not done anything wrong. We have walked in public and sat in someone's front parlor in full view of anyone who cared to observe. There is nothing in any of this that a reasonable person could object to." "I know that," she said. But that is not the criterion being applied. He was pacing, which she had not seen before. He was generally so still, so economical in his movement that the pacing told her how agitated he actually was beneath the surface. "Grace," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. "I haven't said anything yet. You're about to say that you don't want to be the reason I lose my position. I can tell by the way you said my name." He stopped pacing and looked at her. "And if I was? Then I would tell you that I have been making my own decisions about what is worth risking since long before I met you," she said. "And I would ask you not to make the decision for me by disappearing." He held her gaze for a long moment. "That's not what I want to do." "Good," she said, "because it would not help. Hale would find another reason. He's not objecting to you. He's objecting to me." She paused. "He has been objecting to me since October. This is just the most recent form." Levi came and sat down in the chair across from her desk. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment and then looked up. "What do you want to do?" he asked. This was the question she had needed him to ask. Not "what should we do" or "what do you think," but this: "What do you want?" It was such a small thing and such a necessary one. "I want to respond to the complaint formally, through the county board's process, with documentation," she said. "I want Diego Alvarez to know what's happening. And I want you to talk to the county sheriff and find out who has the legal authority here, because I suspect Hale may be operating outside his actual jurisdiction, and I want to know." Levi nodded. He looked at her with the expression she had been learning to read over the past several months, the one that mixed admiration with something more vulnerable that he didn't have words for yet. "All right," he said. "And Levi," she held his eyes, "whatever happens with the board, I want you to know that I would not trade the last several months for a quieter appointment." He was quiet. Then, "Neither would I. The investigation by the county school board took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks Grace taught school, walked the creek on Saturday mornings with Levi, and prepared her formal response to the complaint with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had once spent 45 minutes presenting a comprehensive case to the Caldwell Town Council. She gathered signed statements from 12 parents of her students. She compiled attendance records and grade assessments. She wrote a personal statement that was 3 pages long and entirely factual and utterly devastating, to the implication that she was anything other than fully qualified and entirely appropriate for her position. Diego Alvarez, when she told him what was happening, looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Tell me what you need." He signed the parental statement, but he also went to Wichita and spoke in person to 2 members of the county board who had ranching interests that occasionally intersected with his. And he said to them, quietly and without threats, that the education of children in Caldwell was going better than it had in years, and that the community of working families in the area considered it an injustice that the teacher responsible was being harassed for political reasons. He did all of this without telling Grace he was doing it. She found out again from Levi. In late September, the county board dismissed the complaint. Their ruling was 3 sentences, dry and official. They had found no basis for the allegations. Grace Graves's teaching record was exemplary. The matter was closed. Grace read the letter in her room at Edna Croft's boarding house with her hands steady, and her eyes bright and something loose and light moving through her chest in a way that she had not felt in a very long time. She went to find Levi. He was at the marshal's office, alone, writing up a report on a horse theft that had come in that morning. She knocked on the open door and he looked up. She held up the letter. He read her face. He stood up. She crossed the room in 3 steps and he met her halfway, and she put her arms around him and he put his around her, and they stood there in the marshal's office in the middle of Caldwell, Kansas, not saying anything, not needing to. When she stepped back she was not crying, but she was close enough that it was a deliberate choice. "I need to thank Diego," she said. "You should. He went to Wichita." "I know, you just told me without telling me." She looked at him. "You 2 conspired. We discussed the situation. That's the same thing." He was almost smiling, which on Levi Redmond looked like someone had done something excellent with the light. "Maybe. It was in the aftermath of the board's ruling, in the mild October that marked Grace's one-year anniversary in Caldwell, that things began to shift in a way she had not fully anticipated. The dismissal of the complaint had done something to the town's opinion, not completely and not uniformly, but noticeably. Several parents who had been neutral came to introduce themselves to her at school in a way that felt like an extension of something that had previously been withheld. One of the mothers, a woman named Clara Johnson, whose son Thomas was in the middle group, stopped Grace on the street and said, with the directness of a woman who has made up her mind about something, "I want to apologize for not speaking up sooner. What they've been putting you through has not been right, and I'm sorry for my part in the silence." Grace stood on the main street of Caldwell and received this apology with a composure that cost her something to maintain, and said thank you, and meant it. Clara Johnson looked at her for a moment and said, "You're stronger than anyone in this town has deserved," which was not the same as them deserving it, but it was something. It was in October that Levi brought her, on one of their Saturday Creek walks, to a specific bend in the trail where a stand of cottonwood trees had gone gold in the full force of the autumn, and in the middle of that extraordinary quiet gold he turned to her and said, "I would like to marry you, Grace, if you'll have me." He had no ring. He had not yet been to the jeweler in Wichita to buy one, because he had not been entirely sure until this morning that this was the moment, but the cottonwoods in gold had decided the timing for him. She stood in the October light and looked at him, and thought about everything that had happened in the year since she had stepped off the stage from Wichita with $42 and a letter for a job that didn't exist anymore and a chest full of careful, organized, protected hope. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." He kissed her then under the cottonwoods, and the creek made its indifferent, beautiful noise, and somewhere a red-tailed hawk described a slow circle in the enormous Kansas sky. They went together to the jeweler in Wichita the following Saturday on the morning stage, and Grace chose a narrow gold band set with a small chip of garnet, which was modestly priced and very beautiful, and exactly what she would have chosen if she had been choosing for herself, which she was. Levi paid for it and put it in his coat pocket, and they had lunch at a restaurant that had white tablecloths and served chicken in a cream sauce with biscuits, which was extravagant by frontier standards and exactly right for the occasion. They announced their engagement in Caldwell the following week, and the reaction was what could be expected from a community that had spent a year being ambivalent about Grace Graves. Mixed, with the proportion of good will slightly higher than it would have been a year ago, which was the correct direction even if the pace was slow. Burton Hale, it was noted, did not offer congratulations. But Diego Alvarez did, warmly and sincerely, and Mrs. Dawes, who had gradually come to feel something like genuine affection for Grace over the year of acquaintance, cried a little and offered to host the wedding luncheon in her garden if the weather held. And Clara Johnson organized the women of her church circle to make a quilt as a wedding gift, which was the particular frontier gift that said, "We have accepted you among us even if we were slow to do it." They married on a Saturday in November 1882 in the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, with Reverend Anderson presiding. The church was not full, but it was well attended. Diego Alvarez brought all 3 of his children. The county sheriff came. 12 families from the surrounding farms and ranches that Grace had connected to through the school sent representatives or came themselves. It was not the wedding of a town-beloved figure. It was the wedding of a woman who had earned, through a year of quiet steadfastness, the respect of the people who were capable of giving it. Grace wore a dress of deep green wool that she had made herself over the previous 6 weeks, working by lamplight after the school day ended. It was the finest thing she had made in her life, and she knew it. Levi wore his good coat and a new shirt, and had made the barber trim his hair the day before. They stood at the front of that church in Caldwell, Kansas, on a November afternoon in 1882, and made their promises to each other in the clear, straightforward way of people who understood what they were saying and intended every word. After the ceremony, outside the church in the November chill with the congregation gathering around them, something happened that Grace had not anticipated. Mrs. Clara Johnson came forward and took Grace's hands in hers and said, clearly enough that the people nearby could hear, "Welcome to Caldwell, Grace. Truly welcome. I'm sorry it took us so long." And then several of the others came forward, and there were handshakes and embraces and the specific warmth of people who are trying to correct a deficit of decency that has been running for too long. It was not complete. It was not universal. Burton Hale stood at a distance and Grace saw him do it. But it was real, what was happening in that small circle outside the church in November, and it was enough. Levi took her hand as they walked toward Mrs. Dawes' house for the luncheon, and he held it in the public street of Caldwell without the slightest suggestion that there was anything complicated about it, which was itself a statement he was making, and she let him make it. They moved into Levi's house at the north end of town after the wedding. Grace brought her leather trunk and her books and the quilt the church women had made, and they arranged these things in the two-room house that Levi had built with his own hands, and then stood looking at the result with the particular satisfaction of two people who have arrived somewhere they fully intended to be. He had added a second room and a proper kitchen in the months before the wedding, working on weekends and evenings, which was how she knew without his having said so that he had been thinking about this for longer than she realized. "You built a second room," she said, the first time she had seen the addition. "The house was too small," he said. "When did you start building it?" He was quiet for a moment. January, which was when he had told her about Diego Alvarez at the town council, which was when she had looked at him in the general store and said, "You're not like most of them." She stood in the new room and felt the timeline of his intention settle into clarity. "January," she said, and it was not really a question. "I was being cautious," he said. "You were building a room." "A cautious room," he said, with the near smile that she had come to love as one of the most specific and particular things about him, and she laughed, and that was how their marriage started. Winter that year was hard, as Kansas winters tend to be, with cold that arrived in December and did not ease until March. They lived through it in the particular domestic intimacy of two people who have decided to share their life. The early mornings with coffee and the newspaper, the evenings with books and lamplight, the small negotiations of shared space and shared time that are the actual substance of love when you strip away the mythology. Grace continued teaching. She had worried briefly that marriage would be used as a reason to revisit her appointment. A married woman teaching school was slightly less objectionable than an unmarried one in the view of certain town council members, but it opened its own category of scrutiny. But the county board's ruling had created a kind of protective clarity around her position, and no one moved to disturb it. She was happy. She noticed this about herself with something approaching wonder in those winter months, the specific happiness that comes from having built something real with someone who is genuinely your partner in it. She had not known quite what she was hoping for when she arrived in Caldwell. She had known what she needed: work, a place, a future that was not defined by the losses of the past. She had not fully allowed herself to hope for what she had actually found. In the spring of 1883, Grace realized she was pregnant. She told Levi on an evening in April, after dinner, in the same flat rock place by the creek where they had had their first real conversation. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before. Unguarded, entirely open, the face of someone who has been handed something they were not sure they were allowed to want. "April," he said. "Yes." He reached across and took her hand in both of his and held it, looking at her, not saying anything else for a long time. Their son was born on the first day of December 1883, which was a Sunday, in the two-room house at the north end of Caldwell, with the midwife present and Levi outside the door in the cold doing what fathers do outside doors in those hours, pacing and praying and being absolutely useless in the most loving possible way. The boy was healthy, loud, and had a significant quantity of dark hair and Grace's dark eyes. They named him James for Levi's father. Diego Alvarez appeared at the door the following morning with a ham and a loaf of bread, and all three of his children, who crowded in to look at baby James with the focused intensity of people who have been waiting for a specific arrival and want to verify the quality of the delivery. Mrs. Clara Johnson arrived with a handmade blanket. Mrs. Dawes arrived with apple preserves and the news that the whole town was talking about the baby. Even the new member of the town council, Burton Hale, had resigned his position in September of 1883 after a financial dispute about the lumber yard that had nothing to do with Grace and everything to do with overextended credit, had sent a card of congratulation. Caldwell, Kansas, in December of 1883, was not a perfect town. No town was. But it was a town that was slowly, imperfectly, correcting something that had been wrong, and Grace Graves Redmond was present for the correction in the most concrete way possible. She was part of it. But none of this resolved the thing that had started this whole accounting, and which had in fact come before the wedding and before the engagement and before October's cottonwoods, and which was the reason this story needed to be told from its most vivid moment forward. It was the afternoon in July of 1882, when Grace had been dragged through the main street of Caldwell by a rope. Let that be said plainly, because it deserves the plainness. Marshal Thomas Cale had received a complaint in July of 1882, the same summer in which the county board complaint was being assembled, though from a different source, that Grace Graves was operating an unlicensed school in the evenings. This was not true. What Grace was doing in the evenings was holding a voluntary reading hour in the schoolhouse for adults who could not read, which she had proposed to the council, and which the council had neither approved nor refused, simply not responded to, which she had taken as a de facto permission, because there was no regulation against it, and she was using a building she had legitimate authority to use. Marshal Cale did not investigate this accusation before acting on it. He sent his other deputy, a man named Carl Sykes, who was young and ambitious and not particularly interested in the nuances of what he was doing, to the schoolhouse one July evening to inform Grace that she was required to close the unauthorized school immediately. Sykes had arrived to find 6 adults sitting in the schoolhouse with primers and Grace standing at the blackboard. He had told her to come with him. She had asked, calmly, on what authority and under what specific law. Sykes, who had not expected to be asked this, had made a decision that was wrong in every measurable way. He had taken a coil of rope from outside the schoolhouse, where it had been left by someone doing work on the roof, looped it around her wrists without explanation or legal justification, and marched her down the main street of Caldwell toward the marshal's office. The adults from the reading hour had followed, alarmed. Other people had come out of buildings and gathered. By the time they reached the square in front of the marshal's office, there were close to 50 people watching Grace Graves being walked through the street with her hands bound, in the particular public humiliation that the town had been building toward in its collective suspicion since October. Sykes was explaining to the gathered crowd that he was detaining a woman for operating an unauthorized commercial enterprise in violation of the town's business ordinance, which was not what was happening, not legally, and not accurately. Grace said nothing. She stood with her hands bound and her chin up and her dark eyes burning, and did not say a single word, because she understood with crystal clarity that anything she said in that moment would be turned against her, and that what was happening here was not justice but spectacle. The crowd watched. No one stepped forward, and then Levi came around the corner of the hardware store on his way back from the East Trail Patrol. He took in the scene in approximately 3 seconds. The rope around Grace's wrists, Sykes, flushed and authoritative. The crowd, Grace standing absolutely still with that expression on her face that he knew by now meant she was holding something back at great cost. He walked to the center of the square. He untied the rope from her wrists himself, firmly, without asking Sykes's permission, which caused Sykes to begin objecting loudly, and then to stop when Levi turned and looked at him with an expression that apparently communicated something sufficient to end the objection. He checked Grace's wrists with his hands quickly to see if the rope had cut. The skin was red but unbroken. He held her eyes for a moment. She gave the smallest nod, which meant she was all right or at least not injured. Then he turned to the crowd, and he said it. He said the thing that was true and had been true for 9 months, the thing that the town of Caldwell had been collectively failing to say and failing to act on, the thing that had been building in him since October when he had first watched a woman who deserved welcome receive suspicion instead. "This woman asked for nothing," he said, "and she deserved everything you withheld." The crowd was silent. 40, 50 people, and not one of them spoke. "She asked for the job she was hired for," he said, his voice steady and low and carrying. "She asked for a fair process. She asked for the basic decency of being seen clearly instead of through the lens of what this town had already decided about her before she unpacked her trunk. She got none of it. You gave her suspicion and closed doors and whispered stories, and a complaint filed by a man who was trying to protect his own authority. And through all of it she did her job and more than her job, and she made your children able to read and calculate and think. And she did it with more dignity than most of you have shown in watching it." He was not shouting. He was doing the much more effective thing, which was speaking with the full, unequivocal weight of someone who had decided exactly when to spend their conviction. "Deputy Sykes acted without legal basis tonight," he continued. "There is no commercial enterprise being conducted in that schoolhouse. There is a woman teaching reading to adults who want to learn, which is an extension of a teaching appointment the county board has confirmed and upheld. The rope was used without authorization and it was wrong, and I am telling you that plainly because someone in this town needs to say things plainly." He stopped. The square was so quiet that the sound of the creek, a block away, was audible. Then he said quietly, "And someone in this town should have said all of this months ago, including me." He turned away from the crowd and back to Grace. "I'm sorry," he said to her, directly, with the crowd still watching. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright. She was not going to cry in the middle of the town square, but she was close enough that he could see exactly what it was costing her not to. "I know," she said, and then quietly, just for him, "Thank you." He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked out of the square together in the direction of the boarding house, and the crowd parted for them, and not one person tried to stop them or say anything further, because some moments create their own conclusion. Marshal Cale, it turned out, had not authorized Sykes's actions. When Levi filed his formal report that evening and the next morning went directly to Cale and laid out the situation with his characteristic precise calm, Cale had the decency to be troubled by what had happened and to tell Sykes, in clear terms, that he had acted outside his authority and that it would not happen again. Cale also wrote a formal letter to the county board acknowledging that the incident had occurred and that it had been handled improperly. This letter, which Grace received a copy of, was not an apology, but it was a record, and a record is sometimes more useful than an apology. The complaint to the county board about Grace's supposed unauthorized school was quietly dropped, because it could not survive scrutiny now that Cale himself had acknowledged its basis was faulty. Deputy Sykes resigned 3 months later and left Caldwell for somewhere further west, and this was considered, by most of the town's residents, to be an uncomplicated improvement. It was this moment, that afternoon in the square, with the rope and the crowd, and the words that Levi had said that the town of Caldwell carried forward into its own memory, with the complicated feeling of a community that had witnessed something it could not entirely take credit for, and could not entirely escape responsibility for either. It was talked about in the way that defining moments in small towns are talked about, repeatedly, with evolving interpretations, with the gradual accumulation of retrospective clarity that is always easier than actual clarity at the time. Grace herself rarely talked about it. She absorbed it as she absorbed most things. into the deep, organized interior that she had been maintaining since long before Caldwell, where difficult things were held and examined and eventually placed, not forgotten but stored correctly. She talked about it once with Levi fully about 6 months after it happened, when they were already engaged and the distance was sufficient to allow for honest discussion. "Were you afraid?" he asked. "That afternoon, standing there?" "Not the way you mean," she said. "I wasn't afraid for my safety. I was afraid that I would lose my composure in front of all of them and give them exactly what they'd been trying to get from me for months." "What were they trying to get?" "Evidence that I was what they'd decided I was," she said. "Proof that I couldn't handle it, confirmation of their theory." She paused. "I was not going to give them that." "You didn't," he said. "No," she said, "and then you came." He was quiet. "I wasn't waiting for someone to come," she said carefully. "I had not given up, but when you came," she stopped, started again. "It was different what you did than if anyone else had done it. You weren't only correcting an injustice. You were choosing something in front of everyone, and that mattered." He took her hand. "I should have done it sooner. You said that afternoon. You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to. I'm saying it because it's true." He looked at her. "I watched what was happening to you for 9 months. I understood it was wrong from the first month. I was cautious. I told myself I needed more information. I told myself it wasn't my place." He paused. "Those are the things people tell themselves when they're letting something wrong continue. You were not the town, Levi." "No, but I was in the town and I had some capacity to act, and I waited too long." His hand tightened around hers. "I promised myself I wasn't going to do that again." She looked at him with the measuring, careful look, and then with something that went past it, something softer and more open. "You didn't leave me standing there," she said finally. "That's what I remember. You didn't leave me standing there." They sat together in the kitchen of the house that was now theirs, with the lamplight and the Kansas night outside the window, and that was enough. By 1884, Caldwell was a different place than it had been when Grace arrived, and some of that difference was the ordinary progression of time and the ordinary accumulation of small changes. But some of it was traceable to specific things, and some of those things were traceable to Grace. The adult reading hour that had been the occasion of the incident in the square was formalized by the town council in January of 1883, with a modest budget allocation for materials. By the spring of 1884, it had 14 regular attendees, including 3 men who worked at the cattle pens south of town, a German widow named Mrs. Bauer who had arrived with her children the previous fall, and Diego Alvarez's foreman, a taciturn man named Joe Hatch who had been embarrassed his whole adult life by his inability to read and who was, by April of 1884, getting through a newspaper page by page with the concentrated determination of someone who has decided it is never too late. The town school had 28 students by that autumn, up from 14 when Grace had started. Several families who had been educating their children informally or not at all had enrolled, partly because Grace's reputation for teaching was established enough to overcome the inertia of distance and uncertainty that kept frontier families from formal schooling, and partly because word had spread in the particular way that good things spread in rural communities, not through announcement, but through the specific testimony of people who have been directly helped. Maria Alvarez was 11 by then and learning long division with the focused determination that had characterized her since she first appeared with her braided hair and her slate, and Carlos was 7 and in the school's lower group and had the same intensity and a gift for numbers that Grace was planning to cultivate deliberately. Little Rosa would be school age in another 2 years. Baby James Redmond, who was 8 months old when the year turned to 1884, was not yet at school, but was conducting intensive research into the properties of everything within reach, which kept Grace in a state of sustained attention that was exhausting and entirely delightful. Levi had been offered the marshal's position when Cale retired in the winter of 1883. He had considered it for 2 weeks, talked to Grace about it at length, and accepted it. The marshal's position meant more responsibility and more authority and also more visibility, which was a different kind of pressure than the deputy's role. Grace, who understood visibility in Caldwell better than most, had given him her honest assessment. You should take it. You'll be better at it than anyone else they could appoint, and that matters to the people who need law here to be something they can trust. He had taken it. He was a good marshal, in the same way he had been a good deputy, not through the performance of authority but through the genuine exercise of it, which meant that people who had legitimate concerns could come to him and receive a fair hearing, and people who were causing harm could expect to be addressed without drama or cruelty, but without wavering. He also, in his first year as marshal, established a formal policy that deputies were required to have written authorization before making any arrest or detention, which was a procedural change aimed directly at preventing what had happened with Sykes from happening again, and everyone in Caldwell understood what it was aimed at without him needing to explain it. In the spring of 1885, Grace told him she was pregnant again. They were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, with James in his crib in the next room having finally achieved the unconsciousness that he resisted every night with tremendous determination, and Grace looked across the table at Levi with the expression he had learned to read as the one she wore when she had decided something, and was now proceeding from that decision. "There will be two of them," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then the near smile appeared, and then it became the full smile, which was rare enough that it always felt like discovering something. "James will be insufferable," he said. "He already is," Grace said. "He'll adapt." Their daughter arrived in November of 1885, on a cold and clear night that turned the stars outside the window into something extraordinary. They named her Clara, for Clara Johnson, who had been the first person in Caldwell to offer Grace the apology that was owed. Clara Johnson herself received this information sitting in her parlor the following week, and cried properly over it, and then recovered and brought a very good apple cake to celebrate. With 2 children, the 2-room house was genuinely too small, and Levi spent the summer of 1886 building an addition that gave them 3 bedrooms and a proper sitting room. He did this with the help of Diego Alvarez, who had become, in the 4 years since Grace's arrival, the closest thing either of them had to a brother. Diego brought his eldest son Carlos on the building days, and Carlos and young James, who were close in age, developed the fast and inexplicable friendship that children sometimes form around a shared project, which in this case was the project of getting in the way of the adults building the house. The letter from Emmett arrived in March of 1886. Grace had not heard from her brother in 18 months, which was long enough that the quiet worry she had been carrying since his departure to Nevada had begun to sharpen into something closer to fear. The letter was postmarked Reno, Nevada, and was written in Emmett's cramped, hurried hand on both sides of a single page. He was alive. He was well. The silver hadn't worked out the way he'd hoped, but he had found work on a cattle ranch outside Reno and was settled and doing adequately. He had married a woman named Beatrice 6 months ago. He was sorry he hadn't written sooner. He hoped Grace was well. He hoped she had found a good life wherever she had landed. Grace sat at the kitchen table with the letter and read it 3 times. Then she put her head down on her folded arms for a moment, which was as close as she came to weeping with relief, and then she lifted her head and wrote back immediately. 6 pages, beginning from the beginning, Caldwell and the stage and the job that wasn't there and the council and the schoolhouse and Levi and James and Clara and all of it. The whole year and the ones that followed, written in the clear hand she had used to teach 100 children their letters. Emmett and Beatrice came to visit in the summer of 1887. They stayed for 2 weeks in the new addition, and Beatrice turned out to be a compact, sharp-tongued, highly competent woman from Iowa who took one look at Caldwell, Kansas, and said, in the first hour of her arrival, "It's flat, isn't it?" and then set about learning everything about it with the focused curiosity of someone who intends to understand a place before judging it. Emmett and Levi took to each other with the recognition of two men who communicate in similar registers. Directly, without performance, with the specific warmth that does not announce itself. They spent the first evening on the porch talking in the way that Levi and Grace sometimes talked, which was with long, comfortable silences between the spoken parts. And Grace watched this from the kitchen doorway and felt a completeness that she had not known to be incomplete. The summer of 1887 was the summer that Grace also received, unexpectedly, an offer from the County Board of Education to become the county's educational supervisor, a newly created position that would involve overseeing the curriculum standards and teaching quality across 12 schools in the region, including the one in Caldwell. The salary was substantially more than her teaching income. The position required 2 days a month of travel to the county seat in Wellington. She brought it to Levi the evening she received the letter because they were the kind of partnership that made large decisions together. He read the letter. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you want it?" he asked. "I think I'm the right person for it," she said. "That's not the same question." "What's the other question?" "What I'm giving up, the classroom, the children directly." She was quiet. "James and Clara." "James and Clara have a house and a father, and I imagine you've already calculated the 2 days a month into a schedule," he said. She had, in fact, done exactly that, which he knew because he knew her. "I could do both things for a year and see," she said. "You could do both things and make the year tell you what you want to know," he said. "That sounds like how you'd approach it. Is that all right with you?" He looked at her across the table with the expression she loved most, the unguarded one, the one that meant whatever he was about to say was the truest available version of what he thought. "Grace, everything you do is all right with me. That is not the question you should ever need to ask." She accepted the position. By 1888, Caldwell, Kansas had a schoolteacher whom most of the town had come to be genuinely proud of, without quite being able to acknowledge how long it had taken them to arrive at that position, or how much it had required of her to get them there. The stories that had circulated about Grace Graves in the first months of her arrival had not been entirely forgotten, but they had been overlaid by so many subsequent stories. The reading hour, the board complaint dismissed, the incident in the square and Levi's words in the square, the growth of the school, the children who could now read and calculate who had not been able to before, that they sat at the bottom of the town's collective memory under the weight of evidence. Burton Hale had moved to Topeka. Nobody missed him with any particular intensity. The afternoon in the square was still talked about, 7 years later, by people who had been there, and people who had heard about it from people who had been there, in the way that defining moments accumulate in small communities. It had become part of what Caldwell told about itself, the story of the deputy who had stood up in the square and said the thing that needed to be said. Some people in the retelling focused on Grace, on what she had endured and what she represented. Others focused on Levi, on the moment of clarity and courage. Most of the retellings missed something that Grace herself knew, and that Levi knew, and that was perhaps too complicated to fit into the version of the story that travels easily. The thing they knew was this: the square was not the beginning of anything or the end. The square was a moment in a longer thing, a single visible point in a story that was made of much smaller, less visible moments. Diego Alvarez with his firewood and his letter and his trip to Wichita. Clara Johnson on the main street with her apology. The 6 adults sitting in the schoolhouse with their primers on the evening that Sykes arrived. Mrs. Dawes' apple preserves brought to the door the day James was born. Levi building a room in January because he had made a decision and was being cautious about it while acting on it. Grace teaching. Grace counting coins. Grace sitting through every council meeting and every dismissal and every rumor with her hands still and her chin up and her interior life intact. That was the whole story. The square was just the part that could be described in a single sentence. In 1889, Grace and Levi's second son was born. They named him Thomas, not for Marshall Cale but for Grace's father, whose name had been Thomas Graves, and who had worked his land with the kind of patient, principled labor that Grace had inherited and carried forward into everything she did. Thomas came into the world on an April morning with a disposition that was immediately distinguishable from his brother James's. Where James was loud and emphatic, and in motion at all times, Thomas was quiet and watchful and startling in the specificity of his attention. He was 4 months old when he first looked at his sister Clara with the particular focused gaze of someone who is deciding what they think. And Clara, who was 3.5 and had very definite opinions, looked back at him and said, "Hello, Thomas," with the proprietary authority of someone who has been waiting for this visit for some time. Diego Alvarez's children came to know James and Clara and baby Thomas as if they were cousins, which was approximately the social category they occupied. Maria Alvarez was 17 in 1889, and helping her father manage the ranch accounts with a capability in mathematics that Grace took enormous private pride in, though the credit was as much Maria's own determination as anything a schoolteacher had done. Carlos was 13 and already taller than his father, and inclined toward the same quiet precision Diego had. Little Rosa was 9 and in the school, and had Grace's own gift for words in a way that felt to Grace like something worth watching carefully. Joe Hatch, the foreman who had been embarrassed by his inability to read, had by 1889 been coming to the reading hour for 6 years, and was now managing the record books for a small cattle operation he had partnered into, which would not have been possible without the reading. He brought Grace a signed copy of the record books once, folded small, and left it on her desk with a note that said, "In case anyone asks what the reading hour is for." She kept it in her desk for the rest of her teaching years. The last thing to resolve itself, which had been unresolved so long that Grace had nearly made peace with it remaining so, was the formal recognition by the town of Caldwell of what had happened on that July afternoon in 1882. It happened in the autumn of 1890, at a town meeting called ostensibly to discuss the new water main the council was proposing for the east side of Caldwell. The meeting was a routine thing, and Grace attended as she attended most town meetings, because she had learned in her first months in this town that being present for the town's business mattered. Midway through the meeting, after the water main had been discussed and tabled pending a funding review, Clara Johnson's husband, a farmer named Harold Johnson who almost never spoke at town meetings, stood up. He said that he had something he wanted to say that was not related to the water main. He said that he had been in the square on that afternoon in July of 1882 and had watched what happened. He said that he had not stepped forward. He said that he had been ashamed of that since the next morning, when he woke up and had to look at himself in the mirror and find the honest accounting of the previous day. He said that he thought the town ought to formally acknowledge what had been done wrong, because formal acknowledgement was different from individual guilt and served a different purpose. It was the community naming its own error, which was the only way a community could actually correct it. There was silence. Then a few other people spoke. Some of them agreed. Some of them were uncomfortable with the idea of a formal acknowledgement because it felt retrospective and complicated. Some of them were not certain what form such a recognition would take. What it took eventually was simple. The council voted at the following meeting to commission a plaque for the schoolhouse, which was by then the most significant public building in Caldwell outside the church. The plaque read, "This schoolhouse served the education of the community of Caldwell and the surrounding region for decades." It represented the belief that teaching deserves respect, that every person deserves a fair welcome, and that a community is measured by how it treats those who ask of it only the chance to serve. It did not name Grace specifically, which was both a limitation and, in a way, a kind of respect. Her name did not need to be on a plaque because it was already on the records and in the memories, and in the reading of the people who had sat in the schoolhouse, or sent their children there, or stood in the square that July afternoon and finally understood something about what they had been doing. The plaque was mounted in the autumn of 1890. Grace stood in front of it after the ceremony and read it twice, and then turned away with the particular composure of someone who has been given something they had stopped expecting. Levi was beside her. He did not say anything, because he had learned over 8 years of marriage the precise moments that required speech and the ones that required only presence. This was the latter. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him very briefly in the way she did sometimes when she allowed herself to take the support that was being offered without assessing whether she needed it. James and Clara and baby Thomas were nearby, variously engaged in not standing still, which was their collective response to official ceremonies. Diego Alvarez stood a few feet away with Maria and Carlos and Rosa, and looked at the plaque with the expression of a man who has watched an injustice work its slow way toward correction and is not surprised but is profoundly relieved. Clara Johnson, who was standing beside her husband Harold, caught Grace's eyes across the small gathering and smiled. Grace smiled back, the real smile, the one that changed her whole face. They walked home in the October afternoon, Levi and Grace, with James running ahead and Clara holding Grace's other hand and Thomas in Levi's arms, conducting his usual investigation of the world at face level. The cottonwoods on the creek trail were gold again, as they had been the October he proposed, as they would be every October the Kansas autumn came through and turned everything it touched into something worth stopping for. "Are you all right?" Levi asked. "I'm good," Grace said. "I'm genuinely, entirely good." He looked at her sideways. "Not just good, tell me the whole thing." She considered it as they walked. As the October light came through the golden trees and James shouted something at a bird, and Clara said, "What kind, James, what kind?" with the taxonomic urgency of someone who has been taught to identify things precisely. "I came here with a letter for a job that was already gone," she said. "I had $42 and 2 months of solvency, and no one here had heard of me. And now I have this." She meant the children, the house, him, the town that was complicated and imperfect and slowly, genuinely trying. She meant the school and the adult reading hour and the plaque and the creek trail and the cottonwoods. She meant 8 years of a life that was not the life she had planned, because the life she had planned had been dismantled by the ordinary catastrophe of economic loss and family death, and had needed to be rebuilt from what remained. 8 years ago this month, Levi said. October 1882. "You proposed under these exact trees." "I know, I planned it. The trees were deliberate," she laughed. "You did not plan the trees." "I noticed the trees in September and waited for the right Friday," he said, which was exactly the kind of thing Levi Redmond would do, and which was why she loved him in the specific way that she did, which was permanently and without reservation, and with the full knowledge of what he was. James came running back from wherever he had gone, red-faced and entirely happy, and announced that there was a rabbit under a bush by the trail, and it had not moved when he approached, which was a matter of great significance that required their immediate attention. They followed him to see the rabbit. The rabbit was, in fact, there, brown and very still in the way that rabbits are still when they have decided that motionlessness is their best available option. It sat under the bush with its nose working, and regarded them all with the philosophical calm of an animal that has made its peace with whatever comes. They stood there together, Levi with Thomas against his chest, Grace with Clara's hand in hers, James crouched in the dirt with his face close to the rabbit's level. The October light was the particular gold that only Kansas manages, coming through the cottonwoods at the angle that makes everything it touches look significant. The rabbit sat in its bush. The family stood in the October afternoon. And Grace Graves Redmond, who had arrived in this place with nothing but her credentials and her quiet, stubborn hope, who had been refused and suspected and dragged through the streets, and eventually and imperfectly and genuinely welcomed, who had taught people to read and given Diego Alvarez's children a teacher, and given Caldwell a reason to reconsider what it had decided about itself, who had loved and been loved by a man who was willing to stand in the square and say the true thing clearly when it needed to be said. Grace stood in all of that and breathed in the October air and felt, in her whole chest and all through her, the specific warmth of a life that has been built exactly right. The rabbit decided that enough was enough and disappeared under the bush. James made a noise of protest. Clara said, "Where did it go?" Thomas, from Levi's arms, pointed at the bush with great authority. Grace laughed. Levi looked at her over the heads of their children in the October afternoon, and the way he looked at her was exactly the way he had looked at her in the general store doorway in November of 1881, and in the marshal's office when she held up the dismissal letter, and in the square when he turned from the crowd to find her eyes, and under the cottonwoods when she said yes. Directly, with everything in it, with nothing held back. She held his eyes and let him see everything in hers, which was love and certainty and the simple, complete satisfaction of a person who is exactly where they intended to be. "Come on," she said to her children. "Let's go home." And they went home, down the golden trail in the October afternoon, in the life they had made together.